Well, thank you, Professor Cicerone. And before I introduce today's distinguished speaker, I'm really excited to officially welcome on behalf of the President not only our distinguished speaker, but our new Canadian Consul General to the New England States, Mr. Pat Binns. Before I joined the administration here at the university, I had the great pleasure of working at the consulate for the better part of 7 years. And I had the opportunity to welcome Mr. Binns in a different capacity when he was the Premier of Prince Edward Island. So welcome back, sir. We're delighted to have you. I also just wanted to say a few words of congratulations to all those who continue to make Canadian Studies such a thriving program on this campus. As Tony mentioned, this is the 12th Distinguished Canadian Annual Address, but it's actually the 37th year for Canadian Studies, which makes this one of the most historic programs of any kind on this entire campus. So we're really excited about that. The other thing I would mention about Canadian Studies is that our very first distinguished endowed professorship is in Canadian Studies, and that's the Killam Professorship. Each year, the university is able to, with private funds, bring a distinguished Canadian scholar to campus, and we are delighted to be the beneficiary of that. As we are also delighted to be the beneficiary of an invitation to be one of just 3 institutions in all of the New England states to participate in the Killam Fellowship Program, which directly benefits our students. And then last but certainly not least, is the fact that at least one faculty member sitting in this very room has participated in a very distinguished fellowship through the Fulbright program to study in the past in Canada as well. So this is an institution that has a tremendous history, and I still think tremendous untapped potential in terms of the promotion of Canada and the U.S.-Canada relationship. And I'm delighted to be a proud Canadianist in the President's office. With that, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, who is a man with a long and illustrious career in service, not only to his native country of Canada, but also as a lead counsel and strategic advisor with respect to international partnerships and foreign investments. His area of expertise include the environment, new information technologies, real estate, the entertainment industry, and financial services. His input and commentary in these complex areas has earned him a deeply respected reputation throughout the international community and throughout the world. As a lawyer, a physician, and the former Premier of the province of Quebec, he has extensive experience in international negotiations with the United Nations on environmental and development issues. In 2001, he was appointed the Chief Advisor and Chief Negotiator for the Government of Quebec in the softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the United States. He's a prolific author and is the co-author of The Environment and NAFTA, Understanding and Implementing the New Continental Law. He is also the author of Beyond Trade, the Case for a Broadened International Government Agenda. At the same time, he has published numerous essays and articles on international trade, globalization, and the environment, and he is regularly invited to counsel governments and institutions, both here in North America and around the world, and to speak on the workings and the inner workings and effects of globalization. He's the recipient of an honorary doctorate, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and a Grand Officer of the National Order of Quebec. This afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor, on behalf of our President, Dr. Dana Molifaria, to introduce to you the Honourable Pierre Marc Johnson, former Premier of the province of Quebec and this year's Distinguished Canadian Speaker.
Now you'll tell me if this works. Can you hear me up there? Thank you very much. Maybe I'll be able to understand myself if you can hear me up there. Mr. Consul General, thank you for being here. Mr. Inban, Mr. Baldwin, Mr. Cicerone, it's a great honor for me to be at Bridgewater State College and University, I understand. It's a thriving place, a very dynamic campus, an impressive place. Obviously, intellectually, from the conversations I've had with some of the faculty here, but also the dynamism of this place, which one can see as buildings are literally coming up on your campus. Professor Cicerone asked me to talk about Canada and Quebec, and yet he put out a poster in which I would talk to you about the negotiations between Canada and the European Union. So I understand I'll have to do both, which is usually the way this works. First of all, for those of you who don't know Canada well, I want to reassure you that Toronto is not in Michigan. It is in the country up north. Many of you, of course, know Canada, and especially those who are in this Canadian program and others. But I'd just like to remind you one or two things about Canada. One is that we don't have a presidential system as you do. We have, as head of government, a prime minister, which means in practice we live under a British parliamentary type political system, which has one major inconvenience and I would say many qualities and advantages. In our type of system, you cannot be the head of government or run the country unless you can keep a majority of votes in the House. Secondly, when you appoint your ministers, that is your cabinet, they are, with very few exceptions, members of that same House. Thirdly, the members of your caucus, once you deposit legislation, have to vote on the side of the Prime Minister. That makes a country run. It allows less debate and less transparency in democracy because the big debates take place in caucus, behind closed doors. And I can tell you, for having seen some of these over my career in politics, they can be pretty rough debates. They have the great advantage for those who participate in them to be behind closed doors, but the great disadvantage for the open public not to be in public. At the end, I'm glad I don't have to choose between one or the other and say if a presidential system is better with a totally different legislative independent body or if the prime ministerial system is better. All I know is the prime ministerial system allows government to function fairly well and allows actually governments to have a real legacy as they spent some time in power and have kept the confidence of the House. Secondly, Canada, as you might know, is bilingual, but it is not bicultural, it is multicultural. A choice was made over history, largely in the 60s, to make of bilingualism the official policy of the federal government. A policy which is not easy to implement in certain parts of the country, but nevertheless, which is very important. And for those who don't know, we're a country of 33 million people, just north of the border, with the largest landmass of any nation except that of China. With such a small population and such a big territory, one would figure out that in practice we need lots of capital to develop it. And to have capital to develop it, it means that we have to have open borders. So we're a trading nation, have been trying to be for most of our existence. In that trading nation, which is fairly peaceful, accommodating, and a great partner to the United States in most of its ventures, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is the obstinate survival of what would be considered a minority in other places, which is French-speaking Canadians. And I say obstinate survival because when the British troops on the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City in 1759 beat about the same number of soldiers that they were and actually made North America tip on the English side, there were 60,000 French-speaking people then, and there's now 8 million of them. And it's not that much through assimilation, but essentially because they multiplied for 200 years, and in fact, without almost any contact with France. Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. I understand you had to go. Yeah, no, I understand. Thank you. I knew he was not being, I knew he had advised me that he would have to go before. This issue of the survival of the French language and the French society within Canada in practice is one of the, is accompanied by jurisdictional powers longing for recognition. It is one of the two major obsessions in Canada. The other one is what? The other one is not being American, which is one of the obsessions of Canada. The second one is the province of Quebec sort of stirring the pot once in a while, because that's where 80% of the French-speaking population resides. And because Quebec itself is a little more than 80% French-speaking. So in practice, it's a place where you have democratic institutions which have been living there for a long, long time. And it's the only democratic government where a majority of French-speaking people can consider that they control the means of power. They can participate in federal government, as they do, but the level of government in what is a fairly decentralized federation, the government of Quebec is considered by many as the place where you can influence what the society looks like or what it will look like. I know that for some Americans, not those of this area, of course, Quebecers are French people living in North America. They sometimes see us as Latin who like to argue, wear berets, and love smelly cheese. We're often viewed as unrepentant leftists and liberals who have a taste for state interventionism and collective rights. For many Frenchmen from France, though, who have not come to Quebec, Quebecers are seen as North Americans who speak French with a funny accent. To them, Quebecers belong to a continent of great spaces where people inhabit the wilderness with the caribous, drive American cars, eat at McDonald's, listen to Elvis Presley and country music, and they view us as believing strongly in American-type free markets, economic freedom, and individual rights. I guess most of that is true, except for the beret, maybe, and the caribous, and a couple of other things. First, our identity, our culture, our economy, our social life is deeply rooted in this continent. Paradoxically, Quebec's history has far more to do with the United States than it has to do with France. Indeed, Quebec hardly had any contact with France, as I said, for almost 200 years. French Canadians, one could say, secured their future through the Quebec Act thanks to the American Revolution. Indeed, in 1774, Murray, then the governor of what was the area which is now Quebec, anticipating that the population might befriend the American revolutionists, decided to give back what had been taken away after the Plains of Abraham, which was the civil code, the capacity to practice Catholicism and yet be in the public service, and of course, restore the place of the French language. This, in practice, gave the basic instruments for that society to survive and eventually to thrive. And it brought order in the colony, and it kept away the American Revolution. And as you know, we've not totally severed our ties with Great Britain. And there was no act of secession from Great Britain, as there was in the case of the United States. These are pretty fundamental to understand how this society of 8 million people within Canada came about. And once again, 80% of which is concentrated in Quebec. A couple of anecdotes, I guess, illustrate the close relationship between Quebec and the US. Benjamin Franklin is the one who brought the printing industry to Montreal and the Montreal Gazette, what became eventually the Montreal Gazette. Lewis and Clark had a guide named Toussaint Charbonneau, a Montrealer, whose wife, believed by many to be the spiritual guide of the two great expeditioneers, was a Native American from the Shoshones. She appears on the 2,000 silver dollar of the United States with her child, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. René Lévesque, the charismatic figure of contemporary politics in Quebec, was a war correspondent in the US Army during the Second World War. And in addition, we own houses in Florida and Maine, and where we often go to. There's huge transborder regionalism between Quebec, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and northern New York. A few words now about nationalism. Nationalism is often associated with emotions, disruptive activities, anxious collective behaviors. But a sound mind can comprehend that and what's behind it with some serenity. Nationalism is fundamentally a sociological, cultural, political reality found in the words of poems and songs. It is deciphered in behaviors, network activities, in economic and the social realms. Nationalism is about the collective self. It is made of expressions of belonging to a given community. It takes root in various factors such as territory, culture, ethnicity, a community of language, sometimes of religion, and the sharing of historical experiences. It resorts to the use of symbolic objects like a flag. It calls on individuals to demonstrate solidarity towards collective goals, to share common values. Mostly, nationalism is about political discourse and rhetoric and political actions. You've recognized, some of you here, what the Americans usually describe as patriotism. I'm sure large parts of the population of Quebec, as well as most parts of Canada, relate to such a definition of nationalism when it comes either to Quebec nationalism or Canadian nationalism, as is the case for the US when it talks about US patriotism. Often nationalist rhetoric and projects are elaborated in response to threats, whether they're real or perceived. I'll give a simple example. You have a very important Homeland Security Act which was passed and which was called the Patriot Act. It also comes from in response to individual or systemic situations or perceived situations of discrimination that carry frustration, alienation, a sense of injustice that may generate outrage or even desperation. More often than not, nationalism also finds its way in chauvinistic traits, benign manifestation of exaggerated self-praise in a given community. Examples abound, mostly in the sports arena when it comes to international competition, or between the Bruins and the Canadiens. It embellished presentations of economic, social, cultural, and scientific facts or feats, or simply in the boasting about landmarks or statistics presented in totally skewed context. But also, in well-established democracies, nationalism can be a force that allows widespread sharing of a perceived future and the mobilization of a community towards the betterment of life. That is what happened in Canada and in Quebec in the last 2 generations. Like all things political, alterity is expressed in the presence of nationalism. Nationalism is better expressed if there is another. Just as Canadian nationalism sounds somewhat more resonant when it's not being American, Quebec nationalism sounds also clearer if it's antagonistic to the federal government. Finally, the clearest political expression of nationalism in the communities is the community's demands for more power towards its own liberation of whatever forces are viewed as external to that community. This is particularly true of minorities. And for a long time, French Canadians and Quebecers of French origin felt they were a minority in Canadian terms or in North American terms. French Canadian history is about actually a series of nationalism. There was more than 200 years of French Canadian nationalism, I believe. It was religiously, ethnically, linguistically based, and fundamentally, it was territorially Canadian. It gave way to a strong political quest for equality. French Canada, since the Second World War, has demanded, with some consistency, equality and protection for the French language and for French-speaking minorities across the country. In parallel, particularly after the Second World War, emerged also a territorially defined Quebec civic nationalism. This nationalism is, of course, driven by the sense of identity of French-speaking majority of Quebec, but it is also attempting to be inclusive of the ethno-cultural diversity of Quebec society itself. It is rooted in the conviction that survival and progress for French speakers in Canada must rely on strong democratic institutions in Quebec. The main vehicle of this view has been the sovereignist movement, of course, yet it would be a grave mistake to consider all Quebec nationalism as separatism, since all political parties in Quebec, including anti-separatist forces, in the past half-century, have formulated with great regularity constitutional demands for more jurisdictional powers to the Quebec legislature. In other words, nationalism is not necessarily separatism. A quick look now at what happened in the 60s and 70s, which was the period, I remind you, in the world of decolonization. And it was also a period activated by the baby boom generation, in which social injustice was denounced as a favorite activity for all, and very efficiently at that. In these years, two groups of politicians, each headed their way from French-speaking Quebec, one group to Ottawa and one group to Quebec City. The first group of intellectuals, free thinkers, professionals stepped into federal politics with Pierre Trudeau leading them in the 1960s. They assumed control of the Liberal Party of Canada on the federal scene for literally a generation. This was the so-called French Power group in our history. The second group of individuals of the same breed became definers of the Quebec provincial government policies as they dominated the Quebec Liberal Party and eventually the Parti Québécois, which emerged from the Liberal Party of Quebec in the late 60s. The Liberal Party of Quebec, incidentally, has no ties formally with the Liberal Party of Canada. It is one of our not so easy things to understand. But I could be from Belgium. It would be even more difficult to understand. They would be actually, these two generations, that in Ottawa and that in Quebec, and that group which stemmed from Quebec politics, were actually the fathers and the sons and daughters of what we call the Quiet Revolution. On the federal scene, the first group's territory was Canada, obviously. Their political vision adhered to the concept of French Canada as collectively and historically rooted all across the territory of Canada. They were convinced that progress for French Canadians demanded their strong participation in federal institutions and tended to, at best, consider the Quebec government as an equal of 10 provinces, or at worst, as essentially a troublesome group. They had a three-part agenda. First, one of social change connected actually with the Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson in the United States and the British Labour Party reformist agenda. This progressive approach became mainstream in Canadian politics with strong legislative activity in the federal parliament and massive spending to fund provincially administered social programs. The second part of their agenda was the construction of a Canadian foreign policy that would be distinct from that of the United States. The third was the quest to ensure legal equality to French Canadians from coast to coast in Canada and ridding Canada of as much as possible of the vestige of colonial British symbols remaining in Canadian institutions. They largely succeeded, making Canada an officially bilingual country, a prosperous space, a social democratic policy environment that distanced the country from its southern neighbor. Under the Liberal Party's reign in the 60s and 70s, the adoption of energy, agricultural, environmental, and other economic policies was accompanied by what was called by many provinces a centralist approach, i.e. an approach by which the federal government gave a restrictive interpretation to provincial rights and jurisdiction. It was a time of massive use by the federal government of its spending power to invade provincial jurisdictions. The concept of a strong federal government was, in fact, the rallying cry of these efforts in the 60s and 70s. Nation building for Canada was on the order of the day and was systematically accompanied by challenges to the provincial politicians, not only those of Quebec, but also those of Western Canada. On the foreign policy front, the landmarks were the early 60s recognitions of People's Republic of China, the maintaining of diplomatic relations with Cuba under Castro, and a strong systematic approach to multilateralism and its institutions in the UN system, the Commonwealth, the Francophonie. There were also squabblings with the US over the sovereignty over the Arctic, as if things had changed, and the cruise missile testing in Canada. The equity agenda for French Canadians took the form of the Official Languages Act, recognizing the equal status of English and French in federal institutions. A series of related policy efforts aimed at providing federal services to the population in both languages were adopted. In spite of the opposition it met in many parts of the country, the Federal Liberal Party of Canada made its pride of these policies, as it also gave Canada its flag. At the other end, the Quebec nationalist, on what would be called today, very simply and in accepted terms, the national stage of Quebec. Something else was happening in parallel. The second group had conquered the Quebec legislature. University professors, intellectuals, broadcasters, social activists, young professionals, union cadres, and progressive business people formed the core of what was then the Liberal Party of Quebec, with no real link with the federal Liberals. Their territory was Quebec and its legislature. They postulated that the progress for French-speaking people demanded a strong Quebec state institutions. They drew in a traditional nationalist and conservative past, but gave it a social democratic spin modeled on the Scandinavian-type approach to social policies. With slogans such as Maître chez nous, or masters in our own house, under the Quebec Liberal Party, which was not the separatist party, the concept of Quebecer then emerged, gradually replacing that of French Canadian. You will seldom hear someone who is under 50 in Quebec refer to himself as a French Canadian. probably refer to himself as a French-speaking Quebecer, or simply as a Québécois, which unfortunately is an expression which seems to exclude non-French-speaking people. That society transformed itself. Let me give you just a few figures. 2/3 of the population in 1950 was urbanized. Now it's 4/5. Life expectancy was less than 60 years, and the birth rate in Quebec was one of the highest of the Western world in 1950. Life expectancy is now 76 years old for men, 82 for women, and the birth rate is the lowest in OECD countries. In education, more than half of Quebec's population did not reach the 10th grade in 1950, whereas now 80% of Quebecers aged 15 to 19 attend school. University attendance is 9 times higher than it was in 1950, when the population was simply multiplied by 2. In 1950, 90% of the population attended services in churches at least twice a month. Today, less than 25% of the population attends one service a month. In the 1950s, French-speaking Quebecers were largely absent from managerial position in Quebec economy. They had less than 30% of managerial level jobs. In 2000, they had 60% of managerial jobs in Quebec. The education, health, social services system is not anymore controlled by the clergy, as it was for almost 200 years when Murray broke his deal with the elite, so he was sure the Americans wouldn't come and revolutionize what was then Quebec. I'll give you a simple example of what I witnessed. I got to the Collège Jean Brébeuf, a Jesuit college, in the early 60s. I had 6 of my teachers who were Jesuits wearing the cassock and the Roman collar. When I finished at Philo 2, 5 years later, out of 6 of these Jesuits, 4 had married their secretaries. Radical change in less than a generation. But the non-event of that period, the real non-event of all that period is what? Is the fact that everything which related to Quebec's political status did not work. The quest for recognition, the search for more constitutional power for the legislature of Quebec was not met. Sometimes because Quebec couldn't pick up the ball, as in 1974, the Victoria Pourparlers of Constitution, or because the federal government was somewhat intransigent, as it was in 1982, or just because it was impossible because of the rules of amendments of the Constitution. Over the last 40 years, there have been a series of unresolved attempts at setting the so-called Quebec question, from the Laurent-Dunton Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in 1963-68 to the Fulton-Favreau Patriation Formula, the Confederation of Tomorrow Conference of 66-67, the Victoria Charter of the 70s, and the first referendum of 1980. In 1982, the federal government repatriated the Constitution, and in practice, Quebec was left out and didn't find specific answers to some of its traditional demands. The Meech Lake Accord tried to answer part of that in 1987. It was also a failure, and then the Charlottetown effort in 1992 met the same fate. The effort to recognize the so-called concept of a distinct society in Quebec, which is sort of self-evident, has not met with the agreement of the rest of the country. So where are we going from here? Well, we don't need to go anywhere at this point. If you look at the polls, 62% of Quebecers, which means a strong element even of the separatist party, do not want to have a referendum after the next election should the Parti québécois be elected. There's a lull in Canadian politics on that issue, and it is good that it is so in many ways. People don't really want to address these issues anymore, at least for a while, neither in Quebec nor in the rest of the country, which has no appetite at all for constitutional reform. To get a sense of where things are, let's go back to what's been achieved. Firstly, is the importance for the elites to recognize that there's various forms of nationalism in Canada, not only one. One finds its resolve in the Canadian system and adheres to the notion that the struggle for recognition of linguistic rights has been, in practice, won, but at the price of relinquishing aspirations of more power to the provincial government. The other is centered on Quebec rather than Canada, and will find its resolve either in a clear constitutional recognition of what some of the attributes of Quebec, particularly in the cultural sector, should be, or the choice of attaining the status of a nation state. A. B. The second series of facts to be considered are those which are related to the redress of individual and collective discrimination, with not only linguistic overtones, but also overlapping socio-economic status of French speakers in Quebec. Well, it's not true anymore to say that French-speaking Quebecers, or French-speaking Canadians for that matter, are the object of any systemic discrimination. The third element is the changes occurring in the perception of the role of government. Whether it is the federal government or the Quebec government, we live in a market-driven system. We live in a capitalist economy. The market economy is thriving in Quebec as elsewhere in the world. We now have a strong middle class, and Quebec has gone through its Protestant revolution, as I call it, which is it is lawful and desirable to make money. The role of government, such as a powerful source of social and economic change as it was in the 60s and 70s, is now strongly put into question precisely because of the market economy and the fact that you can't spend billions on people's education and expect them to accept that civil servant will make decisions at their place. Finally, Quebec will go on being what it is economically, socially, culturally, whatever the constitutional context is. Economically, it has a GP of some $230 billion, about 20% of Canada's, and can count on its natural resources as a solid base for wealth generation. We export energy. 25% of our revenues come from the export of hydroelectricity to the United States. And not only our revenues, but also our strategic planning, knowing fairly well that the United States considers its energy security as an important factor in its relationship with Canada. Our aerospace industry is just next to that of Seattle. The importance of new information technologies in Montreal is just behind that of San Francisco, Dallas, and Boston. NAFTA makes sense for Quebec, a lot of sense, as it does for the US. Our economy is increasingly integrated to the rest of the continent, with some 69% of our exports going to the US. Culturally, 80% of the movie market in Quebec is made in Hollywood movies. And we can also see The Sopranos, the old versions, or Sex and the City in French on TV. We'll go on exporting our content and win once in a while a César in France, and sometimes, when we're lucky, be nominated at the Oscars in Hollywood for foreign film category. And you will see and hear from all premiers of Quebec, whatever their party is, from all walks of political life, a consistent approach to consolidating and developing the international presence of Quebec. In Europe, particularly with France, with whom we have had solid relations for 45 years, and with the United States, as Quebec has offices in major American cities. The executive branch of government will continue to participate in the Northeastern Governors Conference and adopt programs linking academics, security organization, and cultural institutions. And that is the reality of every day, independently of constitutional change. Thank you.